8. Carandiru. When the Carandiru Penitentiary was built in Sao Paulo during the 20th century, it was considered a model prison for the demands of Brazil's criminal code. It operated from 1956 until 2002, at one point becoming the country's largest prison, housing over 8,000 inmates. Toward the end of the 20th century, the penitentiary became unbearably overcrowded. Guards were outnumbered and struggled to maintain control over the bulging prisoner population, who lived by their own rules. The facility was full of malnutrition and illness, and inmates went without medical care thanks to understaffing. Apparently, doctors were often too scared to even enter the prison. HIV, AIDS, and other contagious diseases spread like wildfire within its walls. On October 2, 1992, two groups of inmates got into a huge fight that devolved into a violent hours-long riot. When guards failed to subdue the 2,069 prisoners that got out of control, they summoned the military's help. Police stormed the prison, forced inmates to strip down, and locked them in their cells. Survivors later claimed that the officers started shooting indiscriminately, even at men who were locked in their cells, cowering in fear, or had already surrendered. At the end of the day, 111 prisoners were dead and at least 37 were injured. No police were killed. Hundreds of bullets were found in the men's bodies, particularly in the face, neck, head, and chest. Many of the dead were found in defensive positions, with their hands to their face, probably in a desperate attempt to shield themselves from gunfire during their last moments of life. The riot went down in history as one of the most shocking instances of human rights violations at the hands of Brazil's military police. And within the country's penal system, justice finally came during recent years with the convictions of 72 officers involved in the massacre. Carandiru was demolished in 2002, with one block being left intact for a museum devoted to all the atrocities and suffering that happened there. 7. Kamiti Maximum Security Prison. Kenya's prisons are notorious for their brutal conditions and inhumane treatments. This is partially due to the overcrowding, since the penal system struggles to meet the housing demands of the country's 57,000 inmates, many of whom are locked up for small, petty crimes. Very little has changed since the 20th century in these facilities, which are mostly governed by outdated policies that date back to the 1940s. Bribery is rampant, and inmates in charge of assigning beds to first-timers charge hefty bribes. Meanwhile, those who work during their time behind bars are paid only cents per day. The Kamiti Maximum Security Prison in Nairobi County is reportedly the country's worst facility. An estimated 3,600 prisoners are housed in the complex, which was built to accommodate only a maximum population of 1,400. There's no running water, meaning inmates have to haul buckets. Disease spreads easily at Kamiti, where 8 prisoners died in a cholera outbreak back in 2009. A large portion of the population suffer from HIV, AIDS, sexually transmitted diseases, dysentery, and more. The prison's G block is infamous for its prisoner-on-prisoner violence, including sexual assault. In 2008, secretly filmed footage showed guards mercilessly beating naked inmates during a contraband search. Rumors claimed that at least one of the victims died from their injuries that day. Top-ranking Kenyan officials condemned the guards' behavior and promised to investigate, but it's unclear whether any disciplinary action was taken or any changes were made to better protect the prisoners' lives. 6. SAYDNAYA Prison. 16 miles, 25 kilometers north of Damascus. A sprawling 247-acre, 100 hectares property contains a prison complex that's rarely been photographed from the inside. The trefoil-shaped building can be seen from Google Earth, but almost no one from the public, other than those getting locked up, can get anywhere near it. Known as SAYDNAYA, this clandestine facility is rumored to be a torture prison that hardly anyone makes it out of alive. Since the Syrian civil war broke out in 2011, tens of thousands of civilians have disappeared. Experts believe many of them ended up at SAYDNAYA, where former prisoners claim to have endured horrific abuse. Various human rights groups have estimated that tens of thousands of inmates have been killed in the facility in recent years, with some analysts putting the number as high as 30,000. Those who've been lucky enough to survive describe mass executions, starvation, beatings, strangulations, and other excruciating forms of suffering. Inmates are often kept blindfolded in the dark and deprived of their vision for days, weeks, even months at a time. Cells are crammed up to 15 times their capacity, sometimes giving prisoners no choice but to take turns sitting down for space. Newcomers are put through terrifying initiation rituals that include getting beaten and assaulted by guards in the most degrading ways. Women are especially vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. The conditions are enough to make anyone go crazy, and prolonged stays at SAYDNAYA have been known to cause hallucinations, breakdowns, and other symptoms of the mind, making a complete break from reality. But no matter how damaged someone becomes, if they manage to eventually walk out of this prison, they're luckier than many who didn't live to see their freedom. 5. Guldani. In September 2012, shocking footage came out on social media of inmates being tortured, berated, and assaulted by guards at Guldani No. 8 prison in Tbilisi, Georgia. The timing of the video's release, just weeks before the country's parliamentary election, was suspicious. But there was little doubt the horrors shown in the clips reflected what was really happening at the penitentiary. If anything, it only bolstered the credibility of some long-standing allegations of prisoner abuse going on in Guldani. The footage sparked long organized protests in Georgia's major cities, where activists demanded justice for victims of the country's prison system. In response to the scandal, the corrections minister, Katuna Kalmakhalidze, fired the penitentiary department chairman David Chauka. Kalmakhalidze resigned from her post just a few days later. Prosecutors were interested in finding out who leaked the videos. They identified former guard Vladimir Bedukadze and initially listed him as wanted in connection to the abuse. By then, Bedukadze had fled to the country of Belgium. He ultimately worked out an agreement to avoid any criminal prosecution for suspected wrongdoing in exchange for helping the government uncover systemic crimes in Georgia's prisons. Following the leak, former inmates started speaking up about their experiences. In addition to being struck and violated, many remembered being subjected to drowning, threats, broken bones, having their fingernails ripped off, and forced confessions. By 2015, conditions at Georgian facilities seemed to have improved. The prison population had decreased by half, and the most brutal treatments that were once commonplace had, for the most part, disappeared. Even the food and medical care seemed to have come a long way. Numerous unannounced visits confirmed that prison officials weren't just staging better conditions for show. While basically any prison system could stand to be improved, the findings show that there are actually efforts being made to improve prisoners' quality of life in Georgia. 4. THOMSON Penitentiary. Earlier this year, the National Public Radio, NPR, and the Marshall Project teamed up to investigate and expose allegations of unspeakably cruel abuse inside a high-security federal prison in Thompson, Illinois. They concluded that it's one of America's most dangerous penitentiaries. 7 inmates have died violently at Thompson since 2020 alone. Sue Phillips, whose son Matthew was locked up at the prison, believes staff members purposely housed the Jewish prisoner with white supremacists. he was beaten and stomped to death by his own cellmates. Since then, 2 inmates have been fatally stabbed and 2 were hanged. 36-year-old Bobby Everson was found dead from blunt force trauma just weeks after writing a letter to a family member, where he says that he suspected staff members were pairing him up with cellmates that were likely to have conflict with him. THOMSON is a designated Special Management Unit, a disciplinary unit meant for the most dangerous of prisoners, including gang leaders. It was opened in 2019 after the closure of another special management facility in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, which was also notorious for high rates of violence. So far, conditions at THOMSON appear to be even worse, perhaps indicating that the Federal Bureau of Prisons needs to consider new methods for managing high-risk inmates before more lives are needlessly lost. 3. GITARAMA Prison. Located on the outskirts of Rwanda's capital city, Kigali, GITARAMA Prison was built back in 1960 as a housing facility for British workers. It was later converted into a prison to house around 400 prisoners, but is currently home to over 7,000 inmates that are packed onto the small property like sardines. At its peak, following the Rwandan genocide in the mid-90s, some had no choice but to sleep in latrines filled with human waste. Prisoners are given very little food and are plagued by constant hunger here. Rumors claim that some have resorted to eating the bodies of the dead, including inmates that have perished from diseases, injuries, and violence the cramped conditions breed. In a place where it's almost impossible to get access to medical care, prisoners who get sick or hurt typically have no choice but to wait and hope that their illness doesn't kill them. In 1995, when overcrowding was nearly at its worst, the Red Cross spokesperson Bridget Troyan claimed as many as 6 people died daily at GITARAMA. Many suffered from gangrene from standing barefoot on the biohazardous feces-covered floor, and some even lost toes. At the time, it was said the stench of rotting flesh and feces could be smelt as far as a mile. The most heavily punished convicts were kept in almost complete darkness in a building so cramped that many were afraid to sit down because they could be crushed to death. Meanwhile, GITARAMA's former commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Kayonga, admitted it was possible innocent people were being held there. While it's unclear if conditions are still this bad, GITARAMA continues to be known as a hell on earth, where inmates are left with unimaginable suffering. 2. Black Dolphin Prison. The Black Dolphin Prison, also known as Penal Colony No. 6, has a history of incarceration dating as far back as 1745, when it served as a jail for inmates sentenced to a life of hard labor. Found near the Kazakhstan border, it's one of Russia's oldest prisons. The facility is home to the country's most dangerous criminals, including serial killers, terrorists, cannibals, and more. Most are murderers. There are about 700 inmates at the Black Dolphin who have killed more than 3,500 people combined, averaging out to 5 or so murders per person. Prisoners are kept under 24/7 video surveillance and are constantly locked in tiny 1- or 2-person cells equipped with 3 steel doors. The cells undergo daily searches while inmates exercise outdoors in cages for only 90 minutes a day. For a 16-hour period, from the time they wake up until they go to bed, prisoners aren't allowed to sit or lay on their bunks. Guards perform cell checks every 15 minutes to ensure the convicts inside aren't entertaining themselves with anything other than books, newspapers, or radio. And when it comes to food, it's sorely lacking. Inmates' diets consist mainly of soup, which is served about 4 times a day. Newcomers are shuttled to the prison blindfolded, so they can't familiarize themselves enough with the region or the prison's layout to hatch an escape plan or attack on the guards. Prisoners are also blindfolded, cuffed behind their back, and forced to walk bent over at the waist when they're being taken between buildings. Their interactions with each other are heavily restricted and typically discouraged too. Speaking with National Geographic, one guard said it bends his tongue backwards to refer to the inmates as people, and that he feels no sympathy for any of them, making it clear the Black Dolphin is not a place prisoners and staff are on talking terms. 1. North Korea's labor camps. North Korea is home to a large and growing network of gulags that have similarities to conditions at Nazi concentration camps. Little is known about what goes on inside the dozens of forced labor camps, which are said to house almost 200,000 inmates combined. Only one person is known to have escaped one of these disturbing facilities. Shin Dong-hyuk was born at the Kaichon internment camp, also referred to as Camp 14 in the early 80s. His parents were prisoners there that were allowed to marry but didn't get to choose their own partner. Like many who are locked up in North Korean labor camps, they were accused of committing crimes against the state, which essentially includes even the slightest disagreement with the Kim dynasty's strict agendas and ideologies. As a boy, Shin lived with his mother and rarely saw his dad, who stayed somewhere else. He failed to bond with his mother thanks to the constant shortages at the camp, which caused him to see her purely as competition for food. Prisoners at Camp 14 worked at a nearby mine and hydroelectric plant. Violence is simply a way of life among the guards, who routinely beat and execute inmates for committing even the smallest offenses or failing to keep up with the grueling pace the staff demands from them. At one point, Shin was forced to watch his mother and brother get put to death for plotting an escape. Those who aren't plucked off by the cruel guards often die from starvation, exhaustion, and disease. He finally escaped in 2005 while working on a remote mountain with little supervision and managed to sneak into Chinese territory. Shin was in his 20s when he experienced the outside world for the first time in his life, and has since helped spread awareness about the horrors that go on inside North Korea's brutal labor camps. Thanks for watching. Do you think you could survive in one of these prisons? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.